Ho Chi Minh's life began not amidst the banners of revolution or the thunder of battle, but in the quiet, dusty rice fields of Hong Tru village in French-ruled Indochina on May 19, 1890. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung to a modest scholar's family, whose roots were entwined with the ancient rhythms of Vietnamese rural life. From the moment he drew breath, the land of Vietnam was already marked by colonial pressure and the grinding inequality of imperial rule, a place where tradition clashed painfully with foreign domination. As a child, he watched the subtleties of suppression and the unspoken sorrow of the peasantry, little knowing that this early exposure to the injustices of colonial governance would set the stage for a life spent wrestling with the world's great empires. The young Nguyen would go on to study, teach, and serve in local schools, but the echoes of his homeland's suffering called to him far beyond the paddy terraces. At the age of 21, he left Vietnam in 1911, working as a cook's helper aboard a French steamer. And in doing so, he began a journey that would uproot him from familiar soil and cast him into the wider, turbulent world. His first steps onto the deck of that ship were the first steps into a lifetime of movement across continents and struggles against forces that would test his resilience and shape his destiny. From African ports to the bustling streets of Boston and New York, Nguyen wandered, often hungry, often exhausted, living among the working classes, absorbing their hardships, and seeing in their struggles a reflection of his own homeland's plight. In England, as in France, he took on any job that would let him survive: shovel snow, stoke furnaces, garden, cook, and retouch photographs, learning firsthand the plight of ordinary people under powerful systems that seemed indifferent to their cries. These early hardships were not merely background experiences, but crucibles in which a profound sense of empathy and a burning desire for justice were forged deep within him, each laboring hour etching into his soul the truths of hardship and the universality of human suffering. In France, he encountered ideas that made his spirit flare. He joined socialist circles, embraced radical politics, and began to understand that independence for his people would require more than mere wishful thinking. It would require unwavering commitment and the ruthless conviction to confront the greatest powers of his time. It was there, in the cafes and halls of Paris during and after World War I, that Nguyen drafted a bold petition to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, invoking the language of self-determination to demand rights for the people of Indochina, only to be met with cold indifference by the colonial powers whose victory had just been crowned. That dismissal was a searing blow, igniting in him not despair, but a fierce refusal to be ignored, a refusal that would deepen when he joined the newly formed French Communist Party in 1920, believing that anti-colonial liberation could not be won without confronting imperialism at its philosophical and institutional roots. Within years, this expatriate revolutionary was no longer content to merely talk about liberation. He became a living, breathing agent of change, drawn into the orbit of the Communist International in Moscow, where he was trained and sharpened into a more purposeful strategist. It was here that he adopted names that would later cloak him in legend: Nguyen A Quoc, the Vietnamese patriot. And it was here that he learned the disciplined art of underground organization, the careful crafting of rhetoric, and the patient building of networks that could endure repression. From Moscow, he traveled as if pulled by invisible threads to Cantonese Guangzhou in China, where he transformed exile into opportunity, gathering Vietnamese youths, exiles scattered by colonial upheavals, and nurturing them into the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, a fledgling organization that carried the hope of a nation yearning for freedom. But the world was a volatile place. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist purges in 1927 dismantled the communist strongholds in southern China, forcing Nguyen on the run again, this time across borders and through shadows, even finding himself briefly imprisoned by the British in Hong Kong in 1931 before escaping to Moscow once more. These years were not mere footnotes but defining crucibles where his resolve hardened into steel. Each narrow escape, each betrayal by shifting alliances, each bitter night of confinement added layers of sorrow, determination, and unwavering commitment to his vision of Vietnam free from the shackles of colonial rule. By the dawn of the 1930s, Nguyen had returned to Asia yet again, traversing to Siam, Thailand, and back to southern China, consolidating networks of resistance fighters, émigrés, and intellectuals who believed that Vietnam's destiny could no longer be dictated by foreign powers. It was in May 1929 in Hong Kong that the disparate strands of Vietnamese revolutionary thought converged when Nguyen and his comrades founded the Indochinese Communist Party, a unifying force seeking to weld nationalism with revolutionary fervor and to give structure to the swelling discontent of a people long denied dignity and self-rule. But even as he helped launch a political movement, Nguyen's life remained one of perilous displacement, of clandestine meetings in back alleys, of coded messages, and the constant knowledge that colonial police were ever on his trail, ready to snuff out any threat to the French Empire. The 1930s saw him spend years moving between Moscow, China, and underground circles, his reputation growing both among Vietnamese freedom fighters and among colonial authorities who condemned him to death in absentia, turning his name into both inspiration and target. Yet through every setback and narrow escape, Nguyen's thoughts always returned to the land of his birth, to the emerald rice paddies shimmering under monsoon skies, to the faces of the peasants whose suffering he had witnessed long ago, and to the unspoken promise he had made to himself that one day he would return to Vietnam not as a wanderer, but as a leader, a harbinger of a new dawn. That dream, born of pain and nurtured in exile, would not be realized for decades, but it refused to fade, even as the world around him descended into the flames of global conflict in World War I. When France fell to Germany in 1940 and Japan occupied Indochina, the tightening grip of war paradoxically loosened some of the barriers that had kept him from his homeland. Steeled by years of hardship, disciplined by revolutionary struggle, and guided by an unshakable vision for his people's freedom, Nguyen, now known widely as Ho Chi Minh, the name that meant "who enlightens," prepared himself for the most dangerous and decisive chapter of his life, the return home after more than 30 years, crossing the border back into Vietnam in January 1941, treating across foreign terrain with the weight of history on his shoulders, carrying hopes that would either be fulfilled in liberation or crushed under the forces of empires that had long dictated his country's fate. The journey back to Vietnam was not a triumphant parade, but a perilous odyssey across landscapes scarred by war, political upheaval, and the watchful eyes of colonial authorities. Ho Chi Minh moved like a shadow through the borderlands of southern China, often traveling by riverboats, hidden paths, and clandestine networks of sympathetic villagers who risked their lives to offer him food, shelter, or a discreet warning of approaching patrols. The man who had once walked the streets of Paris and dined in the cramped quarters of European dormitories now relied on the rugged resilience of his body and mind, honed through decades of exile and danger. Every step toward his homeland was imbued with tension. Japanese forces occupied Indochina. French colonial administrators still lingered in administrative pockets, and rival political factions in the region created an environment of uncertainty where a single misstep could mean capture or death. Yet Ho Chi Minh's resolve never wavered, fueled by the memories of his childhood, the suffering he had witnessed, and the unshakable belief that the Vietnamese people could no longer remain shackled by foreign rule. Along the way, he encountered peasants whose faces mirrored the same sorrow he had known as a boy. Families torn apart by forced labor, crops seized by colonial taxes, and villages burned in punitive expeditions against those who dared resist. Their stories became the fuel of his determination, transforming abstract revolutionary theory into urgent, visceral reality. Ho Chi Minh knew that returning to Vietnam was more than a personal journey. It was a symbolic act that would rally the oppressed and unify disparate anti-colonial movements. By the time he crossed into Tonkin in northern Vietnam, he had spent decades absorbing the ideological currents of socialism, communism, nationalism, and anti-imperialism, weaving them into a vision that was uniquely Vietnamese, yet attuned to global struggles against domination. The months that followed were a test of both patience and cunning. He traveled in secrecy, often on foot or by cart, avoiding major towns where French intelligence and Japanese collaborators might recognize him. He relied on a web of clandestine contacts, teachers, former students, loyal cadres, whose loyalty was forged not merely by ideology, but by shared experience of oppression. In quiet villages along the Red River Delta, He met elders and revolutionary activists, exchanging information in whispered conversations, planning uprisings, and observing the local dynamics that would later inform the structure of the Viet Minh resistance movement. These interactions were not without risk. Each meeting could expose him and his network to betrayal. In some instances, he witnessed the fragility of trust. A single informant could unravel months of preparation. Yet he learned to read the subtle cues of allegiance and to move with strategic foresight. During these travels, he also faced the psychological weight of returning as a leader before his movement was fully organized. He understood that the act of coming home was more than physical. It was an entrance into history, a crossing into the moral and symbolic center of Vietnamese resistance. Everywhere he went, the land itself seemed to bear witness. Terraced fields scorched by tax levies, rivers swollen from monsoons yet threaded with fishing boats that had survived centuries of exploitation, and forests dense with bamboo that offered both cover and a reminder of the resilience of the natural world. As Ho Chi Minh moved closer to urban centers, he began to consolidate alliances, drawing together nationalists, communist students, and labor organizers under a common cause. These negotiations were delicate. Ideological differences threatened to splinter the anti-colonial front, yet his skill lay in framing unity as necessity rather than compromise. Appealing to shared suffering and the urgency of liberation, he walked the line between pragmatism and principle, understanding that victories in the future would require both moral authority and strategic alliances. The backdrop of World War II added layers of complexity. Japanese occupation altered power dynamics, and while some colonial structures were weakened, new threats emerged. Ho Chi Minh had to navigate shifting loyalties among villagers, local militias, and foreign powers, assessing which partnerships could advance the cause of independence and which posed existential risk. His approach combined patience, subtlety, and decisive action, often moving unseen in the night while planning public influence for the day when he could openly rally the people. In Hanoi and surrounding northern provinces, he began to disseminate leaflets, quietly organizing political cells and establishing communication networks to spread revolutionary ideas. The careful cultivation of trust and the strategic dissemination of propaganda allowed him to project influence far beyond his immediate physical presence. Simultaneously, he observed the daily hardships endured by ordinary Vietnamese: starvation, forced labor, arbitrary punishment, and the constant fear of being conscripted by Japanese or French forces. These observations were never abstract. They informed his political strategy, helping him frame the revolutionary movement not as a distant ideological battle, but as a deeply personal struggle to restore dignity, autonomy, and hope to the people. Each village he passed through, each small network he established, and each encounter with ordinary citizens added texture to his understanding of what a free Vietnam might require. Not merely independence from foreign rulers, but also systems that could sustain the population, ensure equitable treatment, and embed justice into daily life. By late 1941, Ho Chi Minh had returned fully to Vietnamese soil, yet the journey was far from complete. Exile had hardened him, but the reality of organizing a nation on the brink of total war presented new challenges. The Japanese occupation meant he had to operate in secrecy, often living among villagers under assumed identities, teaching literacy, organizing resistance cells, and distributing food and resources while constantly avoiding detection. These years were marked by tension and fear, but also by profound human connection. Ho Chi Minh listened to stories of suffering, encouraged local leadership, and inspired hope in people who had been stripped of agency for decades. Every interaction reinforced his understanding that the revolution would not succeed solely through ideology or foreign alliances. It depended on the courage, sacrifice, and solidarity of ordinary Vietnamese men, women, and children who were willing to endure hardship for the promise of freedom. As 1941 turned into 1942, the contours of the revolutionary movement became clearer. Ho Chi Minh's presence galvanized the Viet Minh, providing both moral leadership and strategic guidance. Cells coordinated intelligence supply lines and training programs while maintaining absolute secrecy. Ho Chi Minh's own movements were cautious. Even within friendly villages, he changed locations frequently, aware that any lapse could invite catastrophic consequences. Yet despite the dangers, There was a palpable sense of destiny in the air. Ho Chi Minh had returned to the land of his birth after more than 3 decades, transformed by exile, educated by global revolutionary currents, and tempered by relentless hardship. His dangerous journey home was both literal and symbolic, a passage that bridged his personal odyssey with the broader national struggle, laying the foundations for a movement that would challenge empires, endure betrayal, and ultimately reshape the destiny of Vietnam itself. By the early 1940s, Ho Chi Minh had not only returned physically to Vietnam, but had begun to weave himself into the intricate, perilous fabric of revolutionary politics that would define the nation's struggle for independence. The Japanese occupation, though less administratively intrusive than the French colonial system, created a climate of tension and uncertainty. Villages were caught between the impositions of the occupiers and the enduring influence of local colonial officials, while famine and resource scarcity intensified the desperation of the people. Amid these conditions, Ho Chi Minh's leadership became both a beacon of hope and a magnet for danger. He moved across the Red River Delta and into the rugged mountains of northern Vietnam, where communication lines were thin and loyalty could never be assumed, training cadres in clandestine operations, imparting revolutionary ideology, and instilling a disciplined sense of purpose in those who would become the future leaders of the Viet Minh. These were not merely abstract lessons. They were survival skills, strategies for evading arrest, and methods to organize the population without exposing them to lethal risk. The psychological burden on Ho Chi Minh during this period cannot be overstated. He had been away from his homeland for over 30 years, and yet he carried the intimate knowledge of suffering he had observed as a child, combined with decades of exposure to global political ideologies, revolutionary strategy, and the brutal pragmatism required to challenge dominant powers. Each village he entered became a microcosm of the larger struggle. Children with hollow eyes from malnutrition, elders recounting memories of punitive colonial campaigns, and families torn apart by conscription labor or forced relocations. To Ho Chi Minh, these stories were not statistics, they were the raw human fuel that transformed his ideological commitments into concrete strategies for organizing resistance. He began to systematize the revolutionary infrastructure, creating local committees, establishing communication networks, and coordinating agricultural cooperatives to ensure food security for the insurgent population. These initiatives were both tactical and symbolic. They demonstrated that an alternative form of governance was possible, one grounded in communal responsibility and mutual support, contrasting starkly with the extractive colonial systems that had dominated Vietnam for generations. In tandem with organizing resistance, Ho Chi Minh maintained a careful engagement with international revolutionary movements. He leveraged contacts in China, the Soviet Union, and among expatriate Vietnamese communities in Southeast Asia, securing political support, funding, and training for the fledgling movement. Yet he was always acutely aware that foreign assistance came with risks. Dependence on external powers could compromise the autonomy of the revolution, and the complex web of alliances had to be managed with strategic foresight. Within Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh's presence began to shift the psychological landscape of the nation. Ordinary citizens, long accustomed to passivity under colonial rule, started to perceive resistance as not only possible but necessary. Peasants who had once feared reprisals now found encouragement in the quiet, steadfast leadership of a man who had endured exile, surveillance, and betrayal yet returned to share in their struggle. His approach blended empathy with discipline. He listened to grievances, mediated local disputes, and inspired confidence while maintaining the strict organizational standards necessary for a cohesive movement. The Viet Minh, under his guidance, evolved into a sophisticated network capable of executing acts of resistance, disseminating propaganda, and mobilizing communities with remarkable efficiency. Ho Chi Minh understood the importance of symbolism as much as strategy. In speeches delivered in secluded villages, during secret meetings, and through leaflets carefully circulated to avoid Japanese detection, he framed the struggle for independence as both a moral imperative and a national destiny. He drew upon Vietnam's long history of resistance to foreign domination, invoking the stories of heroes and martyrs from past centuries to inspire courage and a sense of continuity. reminding his listeners that their fight was part of a larger tapestry of national identity. At the same time, he emphasized pragmatism, survival, secrecy, and tactical patience were just as critical as ideological commitment. The tension between vision and practicality became a defining feature of his leadership, shaping the Viet Minh into a disciplined movement capable of both inspiring the masses and enduring the harshest of trials. The Japanese defeat in 1945 created a critical opening. Ho Chi Minh, sensing that the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically, began preparing for a decisive assertion of independence, yet the situation was fraught with complexity. France, seeking to reassert its colonial control, remained a looming threat, while emerging international powers, such as the United States and the Soviet Union, were watching Southeast Asia with keen interest. Ho Chi Minh's challenge was to act decisively without exposing his movement to premature suppression. In the months leading to the August Revolution, he coordinated a nationwide mobilization of Viet Minh forces, establishing parallel governance structures in liberated villages, and ensuring that revolutionary leaders were in place to assume control once the Japanese surrender created a power vacuum. His meticulous planning and understanding of both the social and military dimensions of the struggle allowed the movement to act with unprecedented coordination. The revolution was not merely about military victory. It was about creating the conditions for legitimate, sustainable self-rule. Ho Chi Minh's leadership extended beyond strategy into the moral and psychological realms. He recognized that the revolution's success depended upon maintaining the trust of the population, protecting civilians from unnecessary violence, and framing the struggle as a collective national effort rather than a partisan conflict. These principles, honed during his decades in exile, became the ethical foundation of the Viet Minh and distinguished him from other revolutionary leaders who might rely solely on coercion or opportunism. By August 1945, the Viet Minh were prepared to act. The Japanese surrender created an unprecedented opportunity for Vietnam to assert independence before colonial powers could regain control. Ho Chi Minh's journey from exile to leader had reached its climax, but the stakes were immense. He knew that failure could mean not only personal death, but the crushing of a movement that had endured decades of preparation, sacrifice, and suffering. Across Hanoi and other northern cities, Viet Minh forces moved decisively, seizing key infrastructure, securing public buildings, and rallying ordinary citizens to the cause. Ho Chi Minh emerged not as a figurehead, but as a unifying presence, embodying the culmination of a lifetime spent in struggle, observation, and relentless preparation. His speeches, written and delivered with deliberate clarity and emotional resonance, appealed to shared history, collective suffering, and the moral imperative of liberation. The people responded with fervor, swelling the ranks of the movement and signaling that decades of exile, hardship, and clandestine planning had prepared both leader and population for this historic moment. Ho Chi Minh's leadership during these weeks exemplified a rare combination of vision, discipline, and empathy. He balanced the demands of immediate tactical success with the long-term needs of nation building, ensuring that the revolution's momentum could be transformed into lasting political authority. Each action, each directive, was informed by the dual understanding of local conditions and international dynamics, a testament to his decades spent navigating exile, foreign political currents, and the harsh realities of life under occupation. By the end of 1945, Ho Chi Minh had transformed from a figure of exile and clandestine struggle into the central architect of Vietnam's provisional government. The dangerous journey home, with all its perils, sacrifices, and moral trials, had achieved its first major objective, positioning the Vietnamese people to assert sovereignty in a world still dominated by powerful empires. The story of these years, though often overshadowed by later conflicts, remains a powerful testament to endurance, strategy, and the human capacity to transform suffering into leadership and hope. As the provisional government of Vietnam took shape in the final months of 1945, Ho Chi Minh's vision for the nation moved from abstract aspiration to practical implementation, a delicate and dangerous balancing act that would define his leadership in the immediate post-occupation period. The Japanese surrender had created a rare power vacuum, yet the presence of returning French colonial forces loomed like a specter, threatening to undo decades of preparation. Ho Chi Minh had to navigate this treacherous terrain with extraordinary tact, understanding that missteps could lead to the collapse of the nascent revolutionary state or spark widespread bloodshed among a population still traumatized by famine, forced labor, and the brutality of foreign domination. Every decision carried weight, allocating scarce resources, ensuring the loyalty of revolutionary cadres, and maintaining the fragile unity of a coalition that included communists, nationalists, intellectuals, and peasant leaders who often had conflicting visions for the country's future. In the countryside, Viet Minh committees worked tirelessly to provide basic governance, distributing rice, mediating disputes, and organizing local militias to defend liberated areas. Ho Chi Minh personally visited villages, often disguised or traveling at night, to meet leaders, assess the population's morale, and reinforce the revolutionary ethos of responsibility and collective action. His presence inspired loyalty not through coercion, but through the moral authority he had cultivated over decades of exile and struggle. Yet the challenges were immense. The famine of 1945, which had claimed the lives of up to 2 million Vietnamese, left communities desperate and fractured, and the Viet Minh's attempts to provide relief were constantly tested by the scarcity of resources and the unpredictability of logistics. Ho Chi Minh's strategies reflected both empathy and pragmatism. He emphasized community solidarity, encouraged local food production, and coordinated distribution networks to alleviate suffering, while simultaneously reinforcing the authority and legitimacy of revolutionary governance. In urban centers such as Hanoi, the provisional administration faced additional pressures. French officials, though temporarily weakened, sought to reassert influence, and the presence of foreign diplomats and journalists added layers of scrutiny and diplomatic complexity. Ho Chi Minh had to project competence and stability while managing a delicate interplay between domestic revolutionary imperatives and international perception. Each speech, policy announcement, and public appearance was calculated to strengthen the movement's legitimacy without provoking premature confrontation with more powerful external forces. The political landscape was further complicated by the emergence of rival factions within the revolutionary movement itself. Different ideological currents, ranging from staunch communists to moderate nationalists, vied for influence, and Ho Chi Minh's skill as a unifier was tested continuously. He emphasized shared objectives over personal agendas, framing the struggle as a national rather than partisan effort. Through patient negotiation, appeals to common suffering, and strategic appointments, he maintained cohesion and prevented fragmentation at a moment when internal division could have been catastrophic. Internationally, Ho Chi Minh faced formidable challenges. The post-war world was dominated by powers with competing interests in Southeast Asia. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all viewed Vietnam's political trajectory with caution, and the possibility of military intervention by France loomed large. Ho Chi Minh's approach was multifaceted. He sought recognition and legitimacy through diplomatic channels, while preparing for the eventuality of armed resistance. His decades of experience in exile, interacting with diverse revolutionary movements and observing global geopolitics, provided him with the perspective necessary to navigate these threats with foresight and precision. Despite these complexities, Ho Chi Minh's moral clarity remained unwavering. He framed the revolution not merely as a struggle for political power, but as an ethical imperative, a necessary correction to centuries of injustice and exploitation. He emphasized education, literacy, and civic engagement, understanding that a liberated nation required an informed and active citizenry. In clandestine schools and community meetings, revolutionary ideals were taught alongside practical skills, embedding the principles of self-reliance and social responsibility that would underpin Vietnam's post-colonial identity. As 1945 drew to a close, the provisional government's control expanded, yet the threat of external intervention intensified. French forces, supported by British operations in southern Vietnam, sought to re-establish colonial authority, while Japanese remnants still maintained pockets of influence in strategic areas. Ho Chi Minh's response combined diplomacy, propaganda, and preparation for guerrilla resistance. He cultivated relationships with sympathetic foreign observers, highlighting the Vietnamese people's desire for self-determination while mobilizing local militias and establishing supply lines in anticipation of military confrontation. Within the population, morale fluctuated between hope and fear. Ordinary citizens were exhilarated by the prospect of independence, yet wary of the cost. Ho Chi Minh's leadership was crucial in sustaining confidence. His speeches, often imbued with the symbolic resonance of past resistance heroes, framed the revolutionary struggle as both inevitable and morally justified. He balanced inspirational rhetoric with tangible actions, demonstrating that the Viet Minh could protect communities, manage resources, and enforce justice in liberated areas. This combination of moral authority and practical competence strengthened the movement's legitimacy and drew broader support from peasants, urban workers, and intellectuals alike. In the countryside, Ho Chi Minh's directives encouraged local governance structures that were participatory and accountable, a stark contrast to the extractive, hierarchical systems imposed by colonial rulers. Committees organized communal defense, distributed essential goods, and mediated disputes, providing a model for governance that linked political legitimacy to the well-being of the population. Ho Chi Minh's understanding of the link between social welfare and revolutionary success reflected a synthesis of his early experiences in Vietnam, his exposure to international socialist thought, and his observation of the failures of colonial administration. Throughout this period, the specter of imminent conflict loomed. Ho Chi Minh knew that the provisional government's survival depended on both strategic patience and decisive action. He encouraged intelligence gathering, trained militias in guerrilla tactics, and reinforced the importance of secrecy and discipline. At the same time, he continued to emphasize ethical leadership and the protection of civilians, ensuring that the revolution remained rooted in the moral principles that had guided him throughout exile. By the end of 1945, Ho Chi Minh had not only returned to his homeland, but had transformed the political landscape. The provisional government had established authority in key regions, inspired loyalty across diverse social groups, and laid the groundwork for a broader struggle against imposed colonial rule. The dangerous journey home, with all its personal and collective hardships, had culminated in a moment of historic significance, a nation poised to assert its sovereignty under the guidance of a leader whose vision, experience, and moral authority embodied the aspirations of millions. The path ahead would be fraught with immense challenges, yet the foundation laid in these months, through careful organization, ethical leadership, and the cultivation of popular support, ensured that the revolution would endure, capable of withstanding the trials that lay beyond the horizon. Ho Chi Minh's story, rooted in decades of exile, sacrifice, and relentless struggle, had reached a point where individual courage merged with collective action, and the dream of a free Vietnam began to emerge from the shadows into the fragile but luminous reality of self-determination. As the new year of 1946 dawned, Ho Chi Minh faced a Vietnam poised precariously between the hope of independence and the looming threat of renewed colonial domination. The provisional government he had meticulously built was still fragile, its authority confined to northern provinces, while French forces, determined to reclaim their former colony, were regrouping with substantial military resources. Every day brought a delicate tension, negotiations with the French, management of internal revolutionary structures, and the continued mobilization of the population in preparation for a confrontation that seemed inevitable. Ho Chi Minh approached these challenges with the same combination of strategic foresight, moral authority, and pragmatic adaptability that had characterized his decades-long journey from exile. In Hanoi, he worked tirelessly to establish administrative frameworks capable of sustaining a sovereign state, overseeing civil services, legal structures, and local governance committees. These measures were more than bureaucratic necessities. They were symbolic demonstrations of self-determination, showing both the Vietnamese people and foreign observers that a nation, long subjugated, could govern itself with competence and integrity. Beyond administrative duties, Ho Chi Minh's personal presence continued to inspire courage and unity. He visited villages still scarred by famine and war, walking among peasants whose faces reflected the twin burdens of suffering and resilience. He encouraged education, literacy, and civic engagement, framing these efforts as essential not only for immediate survival, but for the long-term strength and cohesion of the revolutionary movement. The cultivation of popular support remained central to his strategy, for he understood that the legitimacy of any revolutionary government relied upon the confidence and trust of the population it served. While administrative and social structures were being consolidated, Ho Chi Minh remained acutely aware of the looming military threat. French forces, backed by British logistical support in the south, had begun to assert their presence, leading to skirmishes that tested the Viet Minh's readiness and resolve. Ho Chi Minh's response was multifaceted. He continued negotiations to delay confrontation, coordinated intelligence gathering to anticipate enemy movements, and prepared guerrilla units capable of rapid and effective resistance. His decades of experience navigating exile, foreign political landscapes, and clandestine operations now coalesced into a leadership style uniquely suited to these challenges. The August Revolution of 1945, while a historic triumph, had not secured lasting peace. Instead, it had created the conditions for a new and more complex struggle. Ho Chi Minh understood that leadership was not measured solely by victories, but by the capacity to sustain a movement, preserve life, and maintain moral authority amid the pressures of war and diplomacy. In these months, he became both a strategist and a symbol, embodying the aspirations, courage, and determination of the Vietnamese people. His personal sacrifices, long years in exile, and mastery of revolutionary strategy lent him credibility, while his ethical approach to governance and unwavering focus on national welfare fostered loyalty that transcended ideological divisions. International observers, including representatives of emerging global powers, took note. Ho Chi Minh navigated these relationships with care, balancing the need for recognition and support against the dangers of foreign influence undermining the revolution's autonomy. His diplomacy was subtle, patient, and deliberate, reflecting the lessons learned from decades spent in global exile and revolutionary networks. The challenges he faced were immense, yet Ho Chi Minh's leadership during this period demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to integrate vision, strategy, and empathy. He understood that